Rain soaked through Eleanor's cardigan as she knelt in the mud of her own driveway, 74 years old, praying to a sky that gave no answer. In 30 days, the bank would take the only home she had left. She had no children to call, no husband anymore, nothing but silence and a stack of letters she couldn't afford to pay. What she didn't know was that 30 years earlier, she had fed a stranger a plate of meatloaf and never asked for anything back. She had no idea that promise still lived somewhere out there, on a road she couldn't see, closing in fast. Somewhere, 80 miles away, a phone was already ringing. The rain had been falling over Millbrook, Ohio since noon, a slow grey curtain that turned the gravel driveway of the Whitfield property into a river of mud. Eleanor Whitfield stood at her kitchen window for a long time before she finally opened the door and stepped out into it, letting the cold water soak through her cardigan and into the thin cotton dress underneath. At 74, she had stopped caring much about catching a chill. There were worse things than being cold. Losing the only home she had ever known was one of them. The house had belonged to her husband Robert's family since 1961. It sat 2 miles outside of town on Route 9, a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch Robert had rebuilt himself. The same year, they'd expanded the diner out front into what truckers once called the best cup of coffee between Columbus and the state line. Whitfield's diner had closed 11 years ago when Robert's hands grew too unsteady to flip pancakes. The building still stood beside the house, its windows boarded, its sign faded to a ghost of red letters on white tin. Robert had died 14 months ago, quietly, in his sleep upstairs. Since then, the house had felt less like a home, and more like a museum Eleanor wandered through alone. She had raised no children of her own. She and Robert had tried for years, and it had never happened, but there had been a kind of family that passed through that diner over 4 decades. Truckers who stopped every week and knew her by name, teenagers who worked the counter after school. And more than she could count, strangers on motorcycles who pulled off Route 9 when the weather turned bad or their bikes broke down, and who found that Eleanor Whitfield would feed them a hot meal and never ask a single question about the patches on their leather vests. That morning, a letter had arrived from Millbrook Savings and Loan. She had read it 3 times at the kitchen table, her coffee going cold beside her, before the words fully settled into her chest. The bank was calling in the remainder of the mortgage Robert had taken out 8 years earlier to cover his heart surgery. Eleanor had been making the minimum payments faithfully every month since his death, working part-time folding laundry at the church rectory and stretching her small Social Security check as far as it would go. But 6 weeks ago, a new loan officer named Walter Boone had taken over her account, and the letters had started coming faster, colder, laced with legal language she didn't fully understand. The final notice sat open on the table now. She had 30 days to pay the balance in full, nearly $11,000, or the house, the land, and the old diner would go to auction. Eleanor had called the bank twice that week. Both times she had been transferred, put on hold, and told that Mr. Boone was unavailable. On the 3rd call, a young woman let slip, almost apologetically, that a local development company had already inquired about the parcel, that a man named Preston Hale, who ran strip malls throughout 3 counties, had been asking about foreclosure timelines on rural properties near the new highway exit. Eleanor hadn't wanted to believe her home might already be spoken for by a stranger with a checkbook. But alone in the rain that evening, she believed almost anything was possible now. She had no children to call, no siblings left living, and the few cousins she still had contact with lived states away and had their own struggles. Grace Sullivan, her neighbor from the property down the road, had offered to drive her into town to speak with a lawyer. But the one lawyer in Millbrook who handled these matters wanted a retainer of $800 just to look at the paperwork. Money Eleanor did not have. So she knelt down in the mud of her own driveway, the rain running in rivulets down her white hair, and she did the only thing that felt like it was still hers to do. She prayed. Not eloquently, not with any particular structure, just the plain, worn words of a woman who had run out of doors to knock on. She prayed for Robert, for the house he'd built with his hands, for some kind of help she couldn't name or imagine, because she had no idea where it might come from. She did not know that 80 miles away, in a garage on the outskirts of Columbus, a phone was already ringing. Grace Sullivan had watched Eleanor from her kitchen window that same afternoon, had seen the old woman kneeling motionless in the storm for nearly 20 minutes, and something about it had frightened her enough to act. Grace didn't call 911. Eleanor wasn't hurt, wasn't in any medical danger that Grace could see, but she remembered something Eleanor had mentioned once, years ago, almost as an aside. That a man named Marcus, a boy really, back when she'd known him, used to come around the diner every summer on his motorcycle, and that Eleanor had kept his old business card taped inside her kitchen cabinet for 30 years, because he'd once told her, seriously looking her in the eye, that if she ever needed anything, all she had to do was call. Grace had seen that card once while borrowing a mixing bowl. Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Columbus chapter, a phone number, half faded. She didn't know if the number still worked. She didn't know if the man named Marcus Doyle was even alive, but watching Eleanor Whitfield kneeling in the mud outside a house she was about to lose, Grace decided it was worth finding out. She drove to Eleanor's kitchen the next morning, while Eleanor was at the church folding linens, let herself in with the spare key, and found the card exactly where she remembered it, yellowed and curling. She dialed the number with her hands shaking slightly, expecting a disconnected tone. Instead, on the second ring, a man answered. "Iron Wolves, Columbus," the voice said, rough and unhurried. "Who's calling?" Grace introduced herself, explained who she was, and asked if there was any way to reach a man named Marcus Doyle. There was a long pause on the line. "This is Marcus," the voice said finally. "Who gave you this number?" "Eleanor Whitfield," Grace said. "She's about to lose her house." The silence that followed lasted so long that Grace thought the call had dropped. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed completely, quieter, and something underneath it that sounded almost like grief. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." Marcus Doyle had not spoken the name Eleanor Whitfield out loud in over 30 years, but he had never once forgotten it. He was 19 years old the first time he broke down on Route 9, riding a motorcycle he'd bought for $400 from a man who swore it ran better than it did. It was October, already cold, and the engine seized up 2 miles from the nearest town, with no houses in sight except one. A farmhouse with a diner attached, its windows glowing yellow against the dusk. Marcus had walked his dead bike up the gravel drive with his knuckles bleeding from trying to force the chain back on, expecting to be turned away. Instead, a woman in her 40s with flour on her apron had come out onto the porch, taken one look at him, and told him to come inside before he caught his death. That night, Eleanor Whitfield fed him a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes he hadn't paid for, listened while he told her, without meaning to, more about his life than he'd told anyone in years. About the group home he'd aged out of, about having nowhere that felt like it belonged to him, about the motorcycle being the only thing he owned outright. She didn't lecture him. She didn't pity him. She simply refilled his coffee and let him talk. Robert had come in from the garage sometime after dark, taken one look at the bike, and spent the next 3 hours fixing it for free, while Eleanor made up the guest room above the diner in case Marcus needed to stay the night. He stayed 3 nights. By the time he left, Eleanor had pressed $20 into his palm that he tried to refuse, and she refused to take back. And she had told him plainly the words he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You come from good people. Even if you never met them, you remember that. And if you're ever in trouble, real trouble, you call me." He had come back to that diner every summer for the next 11 years, sometimes alone, sometimes with brothers from the club he eventually joined and later came to lead. Eleanor fed every one of them without exception. When Marcus's road brother Dennis Cole lost his mother to cancer at 22, with nowhere to hold the funeral reception, Eleanor opened the diner for free on a Tuesday and cooked for 60 people she had never met. When a winter storm stranded 11 riders on Route 9 during a charity run for a children's hospital, Eleanor and Robert had put up cots in the diner's back room and fed them 3 meals a day for 4 days straight, refusing every dollar the club tried to pay her. The Iron Wolves had a name for her, one they used with real reverence: Mama Whitfield. She was the only civilian, the only person outside the club entirely who had ever been given a memorial patch, sewn by the members themselves and mailed to her as a gift the year the chapter formally organized, a small embroidered rocker that read "Honorary" in gold thread. She kept it framed above the diner's old cash register to this day. The visits had slowed over the years the way visits always do, as members aged, moved, took jobs, had children, as the diner's hours grew shorter and shorter until it finally closed for good. Marcus had heard, second-hand, years ago, that Robert Whitfield had passed. He had meant to write. He had meant to call. He had told himself there would be time, the way people always do, until there wasn't, and the guilt of that unmade phone call had sat quietly in his chest for over a year. Now Grace Sullivan's voice was on the other end of the line, telling him that Eleanor, the woman who had never once turned away a stranger, who had fed his brothers for free through blizzards and grief and every kind of trouble a young man on a broken motorcycle could carry, was about to lose the only home she had left, over $11,000, and a banker who wouldn't return her calls. Marcus asked Grace 3 questions. How much time did Eleanor have? Who exactly was the loan officer? And was there any way to get a name for the development company that had been sniffing around the property? Grace answered all 3. He wrote down Walter Boone's name and Preston Hale's on the back of an old parts receipt, his jaw tightening with every word. "I'll handle it," he told Grace. "Don't tell her I'm coming. Let me do this the way she'd want it done. Quiet until it isn't." He hung up the phone and sat alone in the garage for a long moment, looking at the framed photograph on his workbench of himself at 19, grinning outside a diner with a plate of meatloaf in his hands. Then he picked the phone back up and began making calls, first to his vice president, then to the presidents of the Iron Wolves chapters in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, and Toledo, and then, one by one, to 11 more chapter presidents across 4 states, men and women who had never met Eleanor Whitfield, but who understood, the moment Marcus explained who she was, exactly why this mattered. By nightfall, word had reached 700 riders that one of their own, an honorary member, a woman who had never asked for anything in return for 30 years of quiet kindness, needed help. Marcus set a date, 9 days out. Enough time to organize, and enough time, he hoped, to also deal with Walter Boone and Preston Hale the right way, through paperwork and pressure rather than intimidation, though he intended to make his presence at that bank impossible to ignore. Eleanor, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. She spent those same 9 days doing what she had always done in hard times, keeping busy. She folded linens at the church. She sorted through Robert's old tools in the garage, uncertain what would happen to them if the house sold. She avoided answering the phone when the bank called, because she had nothing new to tell them and could not bear another conversation with Walter Boone's clipped, impatient voice reciting numbers she already knew by heart. On the 6th day, Preston Hale himself came to her door, a trim man in his 50s with an expensive coat and a smile that never reached his eyes. He introduced himself as a concerned local businessman and offered, with the practiced warmth of a man who had made this exact speech many times before, to buy the property from her directly before the auction, for a price he called generous. It was less than half what the land alone was worth. Eleanor told him, politely but firmly, that the property was not for sale. Hale's smile thinned. He told her the offer wouldn't stand once the bank took the house anyway, and that she should think carefully about walking away with something rather than nothing. Then he left a business card on her porch railing and drove off in a car that cost more than she had earned in the last 5 years combined. Eleanor stood on the porch for a long time after he left, looking out at the empty diner, at the faded red sign, at the driveway where she had knelt in the rain 6 days before. She did not yet know that help was already on its way. She only knew that she was tired, and that time was running out, and that whatever happened next, she intended to face it, standing on her own 2 feet. On the 7th day, Eleanor finally agreed to let Grace drive her into town to see the lawyer, even without the retainer, in the hope that he might at least tell her what her options were. The lawyer's office was a single room above the hardware store on Main Street, and the man behind the desk, a tired-looking attorney named Harold Pruitt, listened to her story with the kind of sympathetic weariness of someone who had heard it too many times before. He confirmed what she already feared. The foreclosure notice was legal. Walter Boone had followed the letter of the law in accelerating the loan, though Pruitt admitted, choosing his words carefully, that the speed of it was unusual, and that he had heard rumors around town of Millbrook Savings quietly working with a development group that wanted rural parcels near the new highway exit. He couldn't prove anything. He didn't have the resources to fight it even if he could. His honest advice, delivered with real regret, was that Eleanor should consider taking whatever offer she could get for the property before the bank took it, and she got nothing at all. Eleanor thanked him and left without saying much else. In the car, Grace tried to offer comfort, but Eleanor found she didn't have room left for comforting words. She asked Grace to just drive. They passed the diner on the way home, its boarded windows catching the grey afternoon light, and Eleanor asked Grace to stop the car. She got out and walked to the old porch, the one Robert had rebuilt with his own hands, and sat down on the top step, where she and Robert had shared thousands of cups of coffee over 30 years of marriage. She thought about the young men who used to eat at her counter, about the sound of motorcycle engines pulling into the gravel lot on summer evenings, about how full this place had once been with strangers who became something like family. She thought about the small embroidered patch that hung above the register inside, the one that said honorary, and she wondered, not for the first time that week, whether any of those young men even remembered her name anymore. It had been so many years. People moved on. Life pulled people in different directions, and there was no reason to expect that old kindnesses, however sincerely felt at the time, survived the passing of decades. That night, alone in the farmhouse, Eleanor allowed herself something she rarely permitted. She cried, fully and without restraint, sitting at the kitchen table with Robert's reading glasses still resting where he'd left them on the windowsill the morning he died. She cried for Robert, for the diner, for the life they had built and were about to lose, and for the particular loneliness of growing old with no one left to call when the world became too heavy to carry alone. She thought, in the depths of that grief, about simply accepting Preston Hale's offer. It would be so much easier. She could take whatever small amount he was willing to pay, find a little apartment in town, and stop fighting a battle she had no strength left to win. But even as the thought formed, some old stubborn piece of her, the same piece that had opened her door to a bleeding, frightened 19-year-old on a broken motorcycle 30 years earlier, the same piece that had fed 60 grieving strangers for free on a Tuesday afternoon, refused to let her surrender that easily. Robert had built this house with his hands. She had built a family within these walls, out of people who owed her nothing and gave her everything in return, one plate of meatloaf at a time. She was not ready to hand it over to a man in an expensive coat who saw nothing in this land but a shopping centre. She did not sleep much that night. She lay awake listening to the rain return against the window, thinking of small, ordinary things, the sound of the diner's bell over the door, the smell of coffee at 5 in the morning, Robert's laugh when a trucker told a bad joke for the 100th time. She thought of how strange it was that a whole life could be measured out in such small moments, and how strange it was that a bank could reduce all of it to a single number on a piece of paper. In the morning, the 8th day since the letter arrived, she woke to the sound of her phone ringing. It was Walter Boone's office, informing her with clinical detachment that the auction date had been moved up, not 30 days from the original notice, but 22, due to what the woman on the phone called administrative efficiency. Eleanor understood exactly what that meant. Someone was in a hurry. She hung up the phone and stood very still in her kitchen for a long moment. Then, because there was nothing left to do that hadn't already been tried, she pulled her cardigan back on, walked out onto the porch, and looked up at a sky that was, once again, threatening rain. She did not kneel this time. She simply stood, her hand resting on the porch railing Robert had built, and she said quietly to no one and everyone that she didn't know what else to do. She had done everything right, her whole life. She had given freely when she had it to give. She had asked for almost nothing in return, and now, at the end of it, she was going to lose everything anyway. She did not know that 400 miles of highway were, at that exact moment, filling with motorcycles. She did not know that Marcus Doyle had spent the last 6 days on the phone with Harold Pruitt's counterpart in Columbus, a real estate attorney named Diane Whitmore, who owed Marcus a favor from years back, and who had, working through the night, found something in the foreclosure paperwork that Pruitt had missed, a notice requirement Millbrook Savings had failed to properly serve, one that, if challenged formally and publicly enough, could delay the auction by weeks. She did not know that 700 riders across 5 states had already begun fueling their bikes, checking their routes, and marking a date on their calendars 9 days out. She did not know any of it. All she knew, standing on her porch under a darkening sky, was that she had run out of doors to knock on. So she waited, the way she had waited for so many things in her long life, not knowing that this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, help was already coming to her. The sound reached Eleanor's house before anything else did, a low, rolling thunder that built steadily beneath the actual thunder of the storm clouds gathering overhead, a sound she hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly in her body before her mind had caught up to it. She stepped out onto the porch on the 9th morning, the day of the rescheduled auction, and looked down Route 9 toward town. What she saw stopped her breath entirely. Motorcycles filled the highway as far as she could see in both directions, a river of chrome and leather stretching back around the bend where the road curved past the old grain silo. They came in formation, 4 and 5 abreast, engines idling low and steady as they slowed and began turning, one after another, into her gravel driveway and the overgrown lot beside the old diner. Riders in leather vests marked with patches from chapters Eleanor had never heard of, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Toledo, and states beyond Ohio entirely, filled every inch of open ground around her house, engines cutting off one by one until the morning went suddenly, strangely quiet, broken only by the creak of leather and the murmur of hundreds of voices. At the front of them, walking toward her porch with a gait she remembered instantly even after 30 years, was a man in his 50s, with grey in his beard and a small embroidered patch on the inside of his vest that read, in gold thread, she had sewn herself decades earlier, friend of Whitfield's. "Mama Whitfield," Marcus Doyle said, his voice unsteady in a way it rarely was in front of his club. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, one hand pressed against her chest, unable to speak. Behind Marcus, 700 riders stood in near silence, waiting, watching a reunion 30 years in the making. Grace Sullivan, who had quietly helped coordinate the timing with Marcus over the past several days, stood off to the side, with tears already running down her face. "You remembered," Eleanor finally managed, her voice breaking. "After all this time." "I never forgot," Marcus said. "None of us did." He explained quickly what had brought them all there that day. Not just to stand beside her, though that alone would have been enough, but to fix what could still be fixed. Diane Whitmore, the attorney Marcus had brought with him, stepped forward with a folder of paperwork and explained in clear and steady terms that Millbrook Savings and Loan had failed to properly serve Eleanor with a legally required notice earlier in the foreclosure process, an error significant enough to have the auction halted immediately pending review. Diane had already filed an emergency motion with the county court that morning. More than that, she had spent the last week quietly reaching out to state banking regulators about a pattern of unusually fast foreclosures on rural properties near the new highway corridor, a pattern that, once flagged, made Millbrook Savings extremely eager to avoid the kind of public attention 700 motorcycles parked outside their bank could generate. As if summoned by the thought itself, a car came speeding up Route 9 and skidded to a stop at the edge of the crowded driveway. Walter Boone, pale and flustered, having received an emergency call from his regional director 20 minutes earlier, demanding to know why local television vans were already setting up outside the Millbrook branch downtown, alerted by a call from someone in the crowd who'd recognized the makings of a story worth covering. Boone pushed through the edge of the crowd, sweating despite the cold, his dress shoes sinking into the mud with every step, and tried to explain that there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that the auction could certainly be postponed pending further review, that Millbrook Savings took every customer's situation seriously. A few riders near the front exchanged glances but said nothing, letting the silence itself do the work. Marcus said nothing either. He simply stepped aside and let Diane Whitmore hand Boone the folder of paperwork, watching the banker's composure crumble further with every page he read. Boone's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, and for the first time since the letters had started arriving at Eleanor's house 6 weeks earlier, Eleanor saw something on his face that looked almost like shame. "This can all be resolved," Boone said finally, his voice smaller now than it had been on any of the phone calls Eleanor remembered. "The bank has no interest in bad press, Mrs. Whitfield. None at all." "Funny," Eleanor said quietly, finding her voice again. "You had plenty of interest in taking my house 3 days ago." Preston Hale arrived not long after, drawn by the same commotion, his expensive coat looking suddenly out of place among 700 motorcycles and a gathering local news crew. He tried, at first, to approach Eleanor directly, offering once more to buy the property, his voice pitched for the cameras now rather than for her. It was Marcus who stepped between them, not with any threat in his voice, but with a stillness that carried its own kind of weight. "The lady already told you no," Marcus said. "I'd suggest you listen this time." Hale looked out at the sea of riders surrounding him, understood with sudden clarity that whatever leverage he had imagined he held over one elderly widow had evaporated entirely and left without another word, his car pulling away far less confidently than it had arrived days before. Eleanor stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed, her hand still pressed to her chest, watching 30 years of quiet kindness come back to her all at once in a driveway full of strangers who were, in every way that mattered, not strangers at all. Dennis Cole, the young man whose mother's funeral reception Eleanor had once hosted for free, made his way through the crowd and knelt in front of her on the wet gravel, taking her hand in both of his. "You fed 60 people at my mother's funeral and never let me pay you a dime," he said. "You told me grief doesn't need an invoice. I never forgot that either." "Eleanor, surrounded by 700 people who had traveled hundreds of miles because of a kindness she had given away so freely she'd never once expected it returned, finally allowed herself to weep, not from grief this time, but from something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. One by one, riders she had never met began stepping forward anyway, introducing themselves, some of them mentioning names of old members who had passed away or aged out of the club, men and women who had spoken of Mama Whitfield's diner so often over the years that the newest members felt they already knew her before ever shaking her hand. A young woman named Carly, no older than 25, told Eleanor that her own father had ridden through a snowstorm to reach that diner once, years before Carly was born, and that the story of the woman who fed stranded bikers for free had become something close to legend within the club, passed down the way families passed down stories at holiday tables. Rain began to fall again, lightly this time, and nobody moved. Eleanor stood in the middle of her gravel driveway, surrounded by leather and chrome and mud, and 700 people who owed her nothing and had come anyway. And she understood, perhaps for the first time in 14 months of grieving alone, that she had never truly been alone at all. By that afternoon, what had begun as a foreclosure auction had transformed into something Millbrook, Ohio had never seen before, and would talk about for years afterward. The local news crew that had arrived expecting a small human interest segment stayed for hours, their footage of 700 motorcycles surrounding a widow's farmhouse spreading across the state and, within 2 days, well beyond it. Diane Whitmore's emergency motion halted the auction entirely, and the improperly served notice she had uncovered gave Eleanor's case enough legal standing to demand a full review of Millbrook Savings foreclosure practices. Within a week, state banking regulators had opened a formal inquiry, and Walter Boone was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome. Preston Hale's company quietly withdrew every inquiry it had made about rural parcels along the highway corridor, unwilling to have its name mentioned alongside the growing scrutiny of predatory foreclosure timelines making headlines across 3 counties. But it was what happened in the days after that mattered most to Eleanor, far more than any of the legal victories. The Iron Wolves didn't simply ride away once the immediate crisis had passed. Marcus stayed behind with a dozen of his closest members, and together they spent the following week doing something Eleanor hadn't dared to ask for and would never have expected. They repaired the old diner. Riders who worked construction during the week returned with lumber and paint. A member named Frank Ashford, no relation to the sheriff who shared his surname, as it turned out, a small coincidence that made Eleanor smile for the first time in longer than she could remember, happened to be an electrician and rewired the building's ancient fuse box free of charge. Others replaced the boarded windows with real glass, repainted the faded red sign until Whitfield's diner glowed again in fresh, bright letters, and scrubbed 30 years of dust from a kitchen that hadn't served a customer since Robert's hands had grown too unsteady to hold a spatula. On the final evening before most of the riders began the long journeys back to their home chapters, someone suggested, half as a joke, that they ought to see whether the old grill still worked. It did. And so, on a warm evening 9 days after Eleanor had knelt alone in the rain, believing she had run out of doors to knock on, Whitfield's diner reopened for one night only, and Eleanor Whitfield stood behind her own counter for the first time in 11 years, flipping pancakes for 200 motorcyclists crowded onto the porch, the gravel lot, and every available inch of grass around the building, exactly the way it had been decades before. Dennis Cole manned the grill beside her, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a spatula. Grace Sullivan ran drinks between tables that hadn't held a plate in over a decade, laughing more than Eleanor had heard her laugh in years. Children of members Eleanor had never met ran between the tables. chasing each other around motorcycles parked 3 and 4 deep in the gravel lot, while older riders swapped stories on the porch about winters spent stranded on Route 9 and the woman who had never once turned them away. Someone had brought a guitar, and by 9 o'clock a small crowd had gathered around a fire pit dug into the old lot behind the diner, singing songs Eleanor half recognized from decades of jukebox afternoons. Marcus sat at the counter on the same stool, he told her, that he had sat on the very first night she'd fed him, 31 years earlier, and watched the woman who had once saved his life, now surrounded by 700 people who had, in turn, saved hers. Later that night, once most of the crowd had quieted and the sky had cleared into a wide, star-scattered dark, Eleanor sat on the porch steps beside Marcus, both of them holding cups of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and neither minding at all. "I always wondered if any of you remembered," Eleanor admitted quietly. "It's been so long. I thought maybe it was just a season of your lives that passed, the way seasons do." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You gave people who had nowhere else to go a reason to believe the world could still be kind. That's not a season, Mama Whitfield. That's a foundation. Every one of us built something on top of what you gave us, whether you ever knew it or not." Eleanor thought of Robert, of the porch he had built with his own hands, of 30 years of strangers who had walked through her door and left, in some small way, less alone than they'd arrived. She thought of how she had knelt in the rain 9 days earlier, certain she had nothing left and no one left to call, only to discover that the family she had built one plate of meatloaf at a time had never actually left her at all. It had simply been waiting, all those years, for the moment she needed it most. In the months that followed, word of what had happened outside Millbrook traveled well beyond Ohio. Other chapters began stopping at the diner on their way through the state, not out of necessity now, but out of tradition, until Whitfields became something of a quiet landmark among riders who had never even met Eleanor personally, but had heard the story passed down at rallies and cookouts across half the country. Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind the attention nearly as much as she'd expected to. What she minded, she told Grace one evening, was the silence that had filled the house before, and that silence, at least, was gone for good. The house did not sell that year, or any year after. The diner reopened permanently within 2 months, staffed part-time by Dennis Cole, who had decided to settle in Millbrook for good, and by a rotating handful of Iron Wolves members who passed through on weekends, unwilling to let Mama Whitfield stand at the grill alone again. Walter Boone was quietly let go from Millbrook savings within the month, and the bank, under new local management and considerable regulatory pressure, adjusted its foreclosure practices for every account in the county. Preston Hale's company never again inquired about property along Route 9. Eleanor kept the small embroidered patch that read "Honorary" framed above her register, exactly where it had always hung. But beside it now, in a new frame Marcus had commissioned from a local shop, hung a photograph taken that first reopening night. Eleanor behind the counter in her apron, surrounded by more family than she had ever imagined she still had left, the words beneath it reading simply, "Some doors, once opened with kindness, never truly close." She still prayed on the porch some evenings, out of habit more than desperation now, but when it rained, she no longer knelt in fear of what she might lose. She sat instead in the chair Robert had built, listening to the sound of the diner's lights humming warm against the dark, grateful for a debt of kindness that had travelled 700 motorcycles wide and 31 years deep to find its way home.